I stood there with mud on my boots and a shovel in my hand when I saw a woman in a coral pink blazer stomping across my pasture like she owned the place. Behind her were two men in polos carrying measuring tape. One was already stepping on my irrigation lines. "You're trespassing," I said calmly, pointing toward the weather-beaten wooden sign nailed to a fence post that read "Private Property since 1946. She squinted at me with the smugness of someone about to recite a rehearsed speech. "Actually," she snapped, "you're in violation of Community Ordinance Section 9, and we're reclaiming this land for the Woodland Heights Beautification Project." That's when I raised my hand, gestured at her, and muttered the words that triggered the showdown of my life. "Lady, this is a cattle farm, and you just stepped in fresh manure." She didn't even flinch. She stepped closer, pulled a document from her handbag, and smacked it into my chest like it was some royal decree. I looked down. Eviction notice. In 3 days. It didn't even make sense at first. I'd lived here my entire life. My parents were married under the walnut tree near the north fence, and my grandfather built the original house with his own hands. How could some neighborhood board full of cocktail-drinking, lawn-obsessed socialites just decide it was theirs now? But they had it all laid out in slick legalese, some obscure zoning loophole tied to a development expansion, and they were claiming my farm had technically fallen within HOA boundaries. Karen Tisselt, president of the Woodland Heights HOA, was apparently leading the charge with all the grace of a steamroller on fire. I took the notice and walked back to my porch where my dog Hank growled low as she passed him. She flinched, scowled, and muttered something about unleashed animals. The papers said I had 72 hours to comply or be fined $500 a day. They accused me of having unauthorized fencing, non-compliant landscaping, and unapproved agricultural storage, which I assume meant the barn my grandfather built before HOA committees even existed. I sat down with the notice in one hand and a beer in the other, staring out at the fields, watching my cows chew cud while a woman who'd probably never cleaned a rake tried to erase my entire history. The next morning, they were back, this time with a crew. They pulled up in branded trucks with HOA logos and started staking out markers like it was a subdivision project. A young guy with a clipboard walked straight into my corn rows and started placing orange flags. I marched out with a copy of my land deed in hand and asked what in God's name he thought he was doing. "Surveying," he said. "For what?" I asked. "Perimeter beautification," he replied without a shred of irony. I laughed because what else do you do when someone threatens to decorate you off your own property? Then came the real kicker. Around noon, I noticed one of the workers trying to mount a decorative lattice fence. Trouble was, he picked the wrong side of the pasture, where my electric fence lines run to keep in the steers. I shouted, but it was too late. His drill made contact with the wire, and the loudest zapping pop you've ever heard lit up the afternoon. He leaped back screaming, tossing his drill like it was a snake. No serious harm done, just a good jolt. But Karen saw her opportunity. She stormed over with a voice shrill enough to startle the birds from the silo. "That was deliberate," she barked. "You assaulted my crew." I tried not to laugh. "Ma'am," I said, "that's an electric fence. There are signs. You walked past 3. She didn't care. She pulled out her phone, threatened to call the sheriff, the city planner, and her cousin who worked in real estate law. She said I was impeding community development and that criminal charges might be filed. I knew I needed backup, so I made a call. Just one. 30 minutes later, a dust trail appeared on the gravel road leading to my farm. A dark green Ford truck with government plates rolled up and stopped just short of the pasture. Out stepped my younger brother, Nate. He'd just gotten back from 2 weeks on base and still had his uniform on, military police patch shining, sunglasses low on his nose. Karen's face shifted from rage to confusion as he approached. "Is there a problem here?" he asked in a tone that made everyone freeze. Karen cleared her throat. "This is a private civil matter. You can't." Nate held up his ID. "Ma'am, I am a federal military police officer on authorized leave. I have full authority to assist in matters involving unlawful trespassing and veteran property rights under the 2008 Rural Protection Act. That was mostly true. Nate knew the law better than she did, and he sure knew how to deliver it like a boot to the chest. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to argue but forgot the words. The clipboard guy shrank behind the truck. The workers started packing their tools. I just leaned on my shovel and smiled. Karen, though, wasn't done yet. "This isn't over," she hissed. Nate smiled politely. "Then I suggest you bring a lawyer and a badge next time. Otherwise, this farm isn't going anywhere. And neither are we." She stomped off in a cloud of dust, humiliated, but I knew she'd be back. HOA Karens don't just quit. They regroup, reload, and come back with clipboards full of petty revenge. But now she made it personal. And worse, she dragged it into the spotlight. What she didn't realize yet was that my farm wasn't just land. It was legacy. It was sweat, soil, and sacrifice. And she had just walked into a battle she didn't even begin to understand. I wasn't just defending property. I was defending home. And she just declared war on a soldier's brother. The silence after Karen drove off didn't last long. By the next morning, my phone had exploded with a dozen missed calls, texts from unknown numbers, and emails ranging from "you better get in line" to "I hope your cows get repossessed." At first, I laughed, thinking it was just more empty threats from the HOA echo chamber. But when I opened the Woodland Heights Community Facebook group, one I'd never joined, by the way, I saw a pinned post by none other than Karen Thistle herself. It featured a heavily edited photo of my pasture with words overlaid in Comic Sans. "Unauthorized use of land discovered. Local farmer defies beautification order." The comment section was filled with keyboard warriors praising her for standing up to rural freeloaders. According to Karen, I was some kind of squatter who had cleverly embedded myself on land the neighborhood needed for its recreational development plan. What followed was even worse. That evening, someone dumped a pile of old roofing shingles right at the entrance to my driveway. Not just trash. This was clearly meant to block access. Then came the signposts. Overnight, 4 identical signs popped up along the edge of my land, planted by HOA volunteers. They read, "Future site of Woodland Heights Community Garden under HOA oversight." I ripped one of them out and snapped the plastic in two, tossing it into my compost pile. The nerve of them, claiming they were taking my family's farm and turning it into a place to grow decorative rosemary and overwatered tomatoes, was beyond infuriating. Nate was furious. He came back the next evening after filing a preliminary report with his base commander. He couldn't do much officially, not yet, but he made it clear he wasn't going to let this slide. "This is targeted harassment," he said, pacing my kitchen with his arms crossed. "They're creating a false narrative and weaponizing social media. We've seen this before, overseas and online. It always starts with disinformation." I raised an eyebrow. "So what now?" he grinned. "Now we play back." Word spread fast among the old-timers in town. The guys from the feed store stopped by with donuts and 2 fresh rolls of no trespassing tape. My buddy Lucas from down the road offered to lend me his drone so I could capture footage of any more unauthorized activity. And by the weekend, someone, definitely not me, put up a billboard near the HOA clubhouse with a cartoon drawing of a cow trampling a lawn mower and the caption, "Farm first, HOA later." The real surprise came from the bakery in town. Old Mrs. Finnegan, who'd run the place since before I was born, put up a chalkboard sign in her shop window that read, "Now selling HOA tiers, salted and frosted." Inside were sugar cookies shaped like little houses with frowny faces. It became a sensation. People came from 2 counties over just to take selfies with the sign and grab a bite of sarcastic solidarity. Karen, of course, was livid. Her next move was more calculated. She filed a formal complaint with the county, citing me for having unauthorized utility infrastructure, referring to my well, my barn's old generator, and even my windmill. I got the notice via mail 2 days later. A scheduled inspection had been set for the following week. They even hinted that my livestock operation could be shut down if safety standards weren't met. Nate didn't wait. He made 2 calls, and within 48 hours, a decorated Army engineer showed up at my gate. His name was Captain Drew, and he wore full camo and boots that looked like they'd marched through 5 countries. "Heard you've got an HOA problem," he said with a grin. Captain Drew ran a full inspection of the barn, the wiring, the well rig, and even the feed storage. He documented everything with a level of detail only someone trained by the Department of Defense could muster. "If your barn's wiring is unsafe," he told me with a wink, "then so is half the U.S. Army's Logistics Corps." He issued a signed and stamped statement on letterhead certifying the farm systems exceeded military-grade standards. I couldn't wait to frame that one. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't backing off. Karen had her crew post another inflammatory update online, this time accusing me of violating wildlife protection zones and alleging that my cows were destroying native plant habitats. The absurdity was almost funny if it weren't so dangerous. I got a knock on the door that night from a neighbor I barely knew, Ron, a quiet man who lived 3 blocks into the HOA development. He looked over his shoulder before speaking. "They're talking about fencing off your north field," he whispered. "Said they found some document from the original survey that says it's technically an unclaimed buffer zone." My stomach dropped. That field was where I kept my youngest calves and grew the hay we used in winter. Losing it would mean buying expensive feed for months. Nate called his contact at the Department of Agriculture the next morning. They agreed to dispatch a zoning investigator to verify the original property lines. But even with that coming, I couldn't just sit still. I had to make a move of my own. That night, I printed off 20 large photos of Karen and her HOA volunteers trespassing, captured clearly on the drone footage Lucas had lent me. I didn't send them to the authorities. I posted them on a new website, protectthefarmno.com. The site told my story with documents, timelines, and videos. I dropped the link on every local Facebook group, Nextdoor forum, and news tip inbox I could find. Within 12 hours, the site had over 3,000 views. Nate's friend who worked PR on base helped push it even further. "You want public opinion on your side," he said, "because once the spotlight's on, they can't play dirty without being caught." Karen tried to issue a cease and desist on the website, but by then, it had already gone viral. People weren't just reading, they were reacting. A veterans organization sent me a message offering legal assistance. A local podcaster wanted to do an interview, and someone anonymous delivered a bundle of yard signs to my property that read in bold red letters, "This land fed America before you ever mowed a lawn." Karen made one final move that week, a scheduled inspection by a neutral third-party code enforcement officer. But when the car pulled into my driveway, I recognized the passenger. It was her nephew Jason, the same guy who got zapped by my electric fence earlier. This wasn't over by a long shot, but now I wasn't the one under the microscope. They were. And Nate, he was just getting started. The days following Jason's so-called inspection only made the situation more absurd. He showed up in a cheap windbreaker with a printed code enforcer badge clipped to his collar like a name tag from a high school science fair. He barely looked at anything on the property. Instead, he walked around taking photos of completely unrelated things: my garden hose, an empty feed bucket, a pile of tires I'd meant to recycle. He scribbled furiously in a little notebook, pretending to be official, all while trying not to make eye contact with me or Nate, who stood on the porch with arms folded and the unimpressed expression of a man who'd dealt with far worse than HOA cosplay. When they left, I knew something was coming. Sure enough, that evening I got a letter slipped under my barn door. It wasn't mailed. It wasn't even folded, just shoved under like a ransom note. It accused me of dangerous land use, said I was operating illegal utility zones, and even alleged that my cattle posed significant olfactory disturbance to the community. Translation: my cows smelled like cows. The HOA wanted them removed within 2 weeks. Nate took one look at the paper and laughed so hard he had to sit down. "They are citing smell," he said between breaths. "That's their legal strategy. Cows smell." But I wasn't laughing. This was serious. If they could get the county to buy into any of these accusations, they might actually force me into some kind of compliance process, which could tie up my operations for months or even shut me down temporarily. That's when Nate said something that changed everything. They're not just trying to win this, he said. They're trying to bury you in paperwork, fines, and bureaucracy until you give up. And the worst part, it might actually work if we didn't fight back harder and smarter. So we started digging. Nate pulled up every zoning and annexation document he could find related to the area, going all the way back to the 1980s. I reached out to my Uncle Ray, who used to work in the county recorder's office, and asked if he remembered anything about HOA development around the farm boundary. It took him a few hours, but what he uncovered nearly made me fall out of my chair. The HOA had forged a key survey map used in their expansion claims. A section of their own property lines was based on a satellite overlay that had been deliberately manipulated, just slightly skewed, but enough to make it seem like the HOA territory overlapped with part of my land. And the kicker? The original, correct version of the map had been filed 6 months prior, showing clearly that their claim was bogus. This was a smoking gun. Nate immediately called his contact at the Department of Justice's Rural Land Protection Unit and explained what we had. They told us to hold off on any formal accusations until the legal team could review the documents. But that wasn't going to stop us from turning the pressure back on the HOA in the meantime. So we hit them where it hurt. Public opinion. We updated the website with the forged map comparison, labeled side by side, time-stamped, and annotated. Then Nate wrote a statement and posted it under the title, "Why is the HOA lying about our land?" Within hours, local news picked up the story. Then regional. A reporter came out to do a live segment, filming right from the pasture where cows chewed calmly behind a homemade sign that read, "Forged maps, real cattle." Karen refused to be interviewed, but her silence said everything. And then, like a vulture circling its own reflection, Karen lost her mind. She returned in full spectacle, showing up the next morning in a business suit with a small crowd of HOA members and a bulldozer following behind. I thought it was a joke at first, but no, she'd hired a private crew and claimed they were there to remove unsafe structures. I stood in front of the barn as they revved the engine. "If you even touch one board of this property," I said, holding up a laminated court injunction I just printed based on a legal stop order filed by Nate's contacts, "you're looking at felony trespass and property damage." The driver killed the engine. Karen shouted at him to keep going. He refused. That's when the cops showed up. Not local officers, county deputies. Someone from the sheriff's office had been watching the website and came out to keep the peace. They walked straight to Karen, asked to see her permits, and when she fumbled for an answer, they calmly asked her to leave the property again. The HOA members started drifting away, faces red, trying to pretend they weren't part of the disaster. Karen stayed put for a moment, jaw clenched, before snapping her fingers at the bulldozer driver like he was her chauffeur. "We'll see you in court," she said over her shoulder. I replied, "You better bring a real map this time." We spent the rest of that day repairing the gate they tried to tear out while the cows looked on as if watching a reality show. Nate made grilled burgers that night, and we ate on the porch, watching the sun go down over the pasture. "You know what the best part is?" he asked. "What's that?" They've got no clue what's coming next. I didn't either, but judging by the sound of Karen's voice earlier, I knew she was running out of moves. The facade was cracking. She tried intimidation, lies, manipulation, and force, and failed at all of them. But something told me she wasn't done. The following morning, I got a letter. This one, surprisingly, came certified. It was a summons to appear at an emergency community hearing scheduled by the HOA. They were trying to push through a vote that would officially claim eminent domain over a disputed agricultural buffer zone. Me land again. The hearing was 2 days away, and they'd made sure it would be closed to the public. HOA members only. I showed Nate the letter. He read it twice and smiled the way a man does when he sees a trap he's about to spring shut. "They think they're going to outvote us," he said, "but they forgot something very important." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" He leaned forward, tapped the letter, and said they don't know who just bought property in Woodland Heights last week. I stared at him. "You didn't?" He grinned. "I did. I now own a townhouse next to their community pool, which means I'm now a voting member." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Nate was going to that meeting. Not just as my brother, not just as a soldier, but as one of them. And they were about to find out what happens when you try to play legal games with a man trained to win every fight. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the Woodland Heights clubhouse, the one with white pillars and a ridiculous Fogg's marble fountain out front that sputtered like it hadn't been serviced in a decade. Nate and I arrived early, but I stayed in the truck across the street while he walked in alone, wearing a crisp button-down and slacks, civilian quiet, but with an unmistakable air of authority. He carried a leather folder tucked under one arm and a calm smile that made him look more like a guest speaker than the nuclear option he really was. I watched through the window as he signed in, accepted a little paper voting slip like all the other members, and took a seat in the third row. Karen hadn't noticed him yet. She was too busy standing near the podium, speaking to a small group of HOA regulars who nodded like programmed parrots. They all wore matching polos with the Woodland Heights crest embroidered on the chest. It looked more like a pyramid scheme meeting than a civic discussion. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but forced. Karen opened the meeting by tapping a pen on her clipboard and declaring this a matter of urgent neighborhood development. She introduced a motion to reclaim what she called neglected buffer zones for eco-centric communal growth, a fancy way of saying she wanted to steal my land under the guise of community gardens. She handed out printed pamphlets full of manipulated aerial photos and quotes from some obscure landscaping consultant who supposedly said the area could become the Central Park of the suburbs. The nodding began again. Nate said later it reminded him of a military briefing in a dictatorship, where the outcome was already decided and the ceremony was just for show. But the moment Karen called for a vote, everything changed. Nate stood up slowly and cleared his throat. Heads turned. Karen looked over with confusion that twisted into annoyance and then finally into pale realization when she saw his face. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "Before this vote proceeds, I'd like to raise a point of order." Karen stammered, "This is a closed vote for members only." Nate smiled, pulled out his property deed, and handed it to the nearest board member. "As of last week, I own Unit 17C on Burwood Lane. I am a full voting member, and I have some information this committee needs to hear before attempting to steal my brother's farm." Gasps echoed through the room. One man actually dropped his voting slip. Karen's face turned a shade of red that matched her lipstick. "This is highly irregular," she snapped. Nate held up his hand. "What's irregular is a neighborhood association using forged maps, false code violations, and harassment tactics to try and seize private property that has been continuously operated since 1946. I have here," he continued, raising his folder, "documentation from the Department of Agriculture, the County Recorder's Office, and the DOJ's Rural Zoning Division that proves beyond any doubt that your recent actions are illegal and actionable under federal law." It was pin-drop silent. Nate flipped the folder open and began handing out copies. One woman took it with trembling fingers. Another whispered to her husband. Karen's grip tightened on her pen until it snapped in half. "This is irrelevant," she hissed. "The board has the right to pursue development within community parameters." Nate stepped forward. "Then let me read this." He pulled out the final page. "A cease and desist order drafted by a federal attorney. Any further attempt to claim land outside the HOA's original charter boundaries will result in legal injunction, full audit, and potential criminal investigation." Karen tried to cut him off, but by then, the damage was done. A couple of board members stood up and quietly excused themselves. One actually took off his HOA polo and folded it over his arm like a flag. Nate closed his folder and looked straight at Karen. "You've embarrassed your own board, endangered your members with unlawful activity, and trespassed repeatedly on private land. I strongly suggest you withdraw the motion." Karen's voice wobbled. "You don't have the authority to threaten us." Nate nodded. "You're right, but the federal government does, and trust me, they're watching now." Karen tried to continue, but the vote was no longer even necessary. A member stood up and made a motion to postpone the proposal indefinitely. Another seconded. The vote passed unanimously, with Karen abstaining in stunned silence. Nate gathered his documents and walked out as calmly as he came in, but I could see from across the street the look on her face as he passed. It was the expression of someone who just realized they were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and cornered. Back at the farm, the mood was electric. Word spread fast that the motion had collapsed. The bakery made a new batch of cookies called Karen's Comeuppance, shaped like gavels and tiny barns. Local veterans started showing up to shake our hands. One of them brought a framed printout of the website homepage and said, "Don't ever take that site down. It's history now." Even the sheriff called and said he wanted to drop by for coffee just to see the place and thank us for standing up to the madness. But Karen wasn't quite done. The next day, she filed a last-ditch appeal to the county zoning board, asking for an emergency review of the farmland's historical use exemption. She claimed that recent renovations made by me, like a new solar pump I installed, invalidated the land's grandfathered status. It was a desperate move, one that reeked of spite more than strategy, but we weren't taking any chances. Nate and I contacted the state's Agricultural Commission and submitted a complete timeline of the farm's improvements, showing each one was compliant and listed in our inspection logs. To reinforce our position, we scheduled an on-site inspection with a state official, one who knew Nate personally and had overseen rural preservation programs for 20 years. When she arrived, she laughed at the complaint. "They're trying to say your solar pump disqualifies your cattle operation. That's like saying using a flashlight makes your house a nightclub." That visit turned the tide completely. The final report didn't just confirm the farm's status. It recommended it for historical site consideration. If approved, that would permanently protect the land from any rezoning, regardless of what the HOA ever tried again. I stared at the paper for a long time after she left. This place, this home, might finally be safe for good. Nate grilled steaks that night, and we ate under the stars, the cows resting in the distance, the windmill creaking like it always had. "I didn't think I'd ever get to do this again," I said quietly. Nate took a sip of beer and nodded. "This wasn't just about land," he said. "It was about legacy. And we're not done yet." The next morning, a letter came. This one was official, sealed, and stamped from the governor's office. Nate read it first, then handed it to me. I read it twice to make sure I understood. It was an appointment notice, effective immediately. Nate had been named as the state liaison for residential zoning oversight in our region. Part of his new job, auditing all HOA operations for legal compliance. He smiled, folded the letter, and looked toward Woodland Heights. "Looks like Karen's getting a new neighbor and a permanent audit." The news of Nate's new appointment spread like wildfire through Woodland Heights. By lunchtime the next day, half the neighborhood knew that the very man they had tried to run off the property was now the one who would be overseeing all their zoning and development compliance. It wasn't just poetic justice. It was the kind of twist that made people whisper in disbelief at grocery stores and swap stories with wide eyes at coffee shops. Karen, predictably, went into hiding. She canceled the next HOA meeting, stopped responding to emails, and according to a neighbor who worked in landscaping, was spotted at a storage facility moving out patio furniture. There were rumors she was putting her house up for sale off-market, afraid of public backlash or further investigation. Her closest allies on the board either resigned or quietly started distancing themselves, claiming they had been unaware of the legal overreach. But it wasn't enough to just watch her backpedal. Nate wanted to ensure that what happened to our farm couldn't happen to anyone else. He launched a formal inquiry into the HOA's practices and found a long trail of overstepping behavior, including illegally imposed fines, harassment of older residents, and improper use of HOA funds for personal errands like dry cleaning bills and catered luncheons labeled as community outreach. It was a deep mess, and Nate began building a case with state regulators. At the same time, he introduced a new oversight process that required all future HOA projects involving property boundaries to be reviewed by an independent assessor. Woodland Heights was going under a microscope, and for once, the microscope wasn't in Karen's hands. Back on the farm, life began to feel normal again. The fences stayed up, the cows returned to grazing in peace, and the mailbox no longer held daily threats disguised as official notices. Hank the dog got his favorite napping spot back on the porch, undisturbed by strangers with clipboards. We finally repaired the gate that Karen's crew had nearly torn off, and above it, we installed a handmade wooden sign that read, "Veteran-owned, HOA-free zone." It wasn't flashy, just bold enough to make anyone think twice before stepping over the line. The bakery made one final tribute in our honor, a 3-tier cake decorated like a pasture, complete with little fondant cows and a sugar figure in military uniform standing guard. On the top layer stood a tiny cardboard sign that read, "No Karens allowed." It was ridiculous and perfect. The mayor even stopped by for a photo and presented Nate with a certificate of appreciation for extraordinary defense of rural heritage. Nate didn't care much for awards, but he accepted it for the sake of symbolism, reminding the community that some battles aren't fought with weapons, but with grit, patience, and paperwork. Then came the final surprise. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old documents in my grandfather's desk, I found a folder labeled Special Easement 1947. Inside was a letter from a state senator dated back when the land was first zoned. It confirmed that the property had been granted special federal protection under a post-war veteran homestead program. That meant the farm was not only exempt from most local zoning interference, it was practically untouchable. It had just never been digitized or updated in public records. I handed it to Nate, who laughed and shook his head. "All this fighting," he said, "and we had a nuke sitting in a drawer the whole time." With the new documentation, we filed to have the farm registered officially as a protected heritage site. The process took a few weeks, but once complete, it ensured that no HOA, developer, or bureaucrat could ever try to carve it up again. The land was now sealed in its identity, tied to history and sacrifice, beyond the reach of paper-pushing suburban tyrants. It felt like closure, not just on the legal side, but emotionally too. This place had seen generations rise, seasons change, and storms come and go. It had earned the right to exist in peace. One quiet morning, I walked out to the pasture just as the sun was rising, golden light spilling over the grass like something out of a painting. I watched the cows stretch and shuffle, breathing calm into the breeze, and I felt something I hadn't in months. Stillness. Not silence, but stillness, the kind that tells you things are right. Finally, Nate joined me a few minutes later, coffee in hand, staring out across the land he had fought just as hard for as I had. "You know," he said, "if you ever get tired of running this place alone, I'm only 10 minutes away now. We could build a little cabin over by the creek, raise bees or something." I grinned. "So long as they don't vote for a queen like Karen, we're good." That afternoon, Nate held his first official compliance review meeting at the Woodland Heights Clubhouse. It was a sight to behold. The same room where Karen once barked orders and pointed fingers was now filled with silence and lowered eyes. Nate sat at the head of the table, a calm authority in a sea of nervous fidgeting. He laid out the new transparency rules, the audit schedule, and the penalties for overreach. No one objected. In fact, one of the former board members thanked him quietly but sincerely for restoring balance and accountability. Karen never returned to the neighborhood. Her house sold off-market a few weeks later, and rumor had it she moved 2 towns over under a different name, trying to start fresh. But around here, people didn't forget. Her legacy wasn't HOA president. It was the woman who tried to bulldoze a veteran's legacy and got shut down by military law and neighborly grit. Months passed, the seasons shifted, the soil turned, and every now and then, a stranger would drive by, slow down near the front gate, and take a photo of the sign that still stood proudly, "Veteran-owned HOA-free zone." Some were just curious. Others looked like they came to pay quiet respect, and a few, I'd bet, were HOA folks from other places coming to see the farm that stood its ground. But to me and to Nate, it wasn't about the fame or the headlines. It was about home, the kind of home that doesn't fold under pressure, that remembers its roots, and that welcomes anyone who respects the land and the people on it. A home that fought back and won, not with violence, but with resolve. That night, as fireflies blinked along the fence line and the sky turned deep with stars, Nate raised a toast. Just us, 2 chairs, and the sound of a world finally settled. To the land, he said, and to the fools who thought they could take it. I clinked my bottle against his and smiled. They picked the wrong farm.